Here's the question. What is your view regarding future government regulation and the implication of potential regulatory changes, especially as it relates to the use of cryptocurrency for illegal activities? What is the risk that governments regulate crypto such that they become essentially useless if we're looking beyond the Trump administration?
And then I think there was a connection to the Trump administration, right? So maybe I'll start there also.
It's just essentially saying governments have to or start regulating cryptocurrency so that, and then that could drive them useless if it's beyond the Trump administration. So essentially, let's kind of two-part this. First part, government regulation based on the implication of potential regulatory changes as it relates to the use of cryptocurrency for illegal activities. Let's start there.
There were major changes a few years ago that made the anonymous ownership of Bitcoin become much more transparent. And Rory, you know at Ausperity that when you're conducting in U.S. securities, there are what are known as AML, anti-money laundering laws, and KYC, know your customer.
Right.
And a few years ago, any platform that transacts in Bitcoin now enforces that. So that basically pulled the veil over, so you can't really conduct in anonymity like you could prior. Second, I would say that's kind of a stale narrative as Bitcoin has evolved and become more mainstream. If you think about it, Bitcoin is an immutable ledger. So if you know the protocol, you can follow the history and the trail of every Bitcoin. It's actually a terrible tool for criminals. And there's much more cases of money laundering in US dollars than there is in Bitcoin. And that's connected to that change in regulatory rules of applying AML and KYC to the overall transaction. Number two, I don't think it's attributable to the Trump administration. Bitcoin is now 15 years old. You saw the returns, you showed them before.
I don't think that's the point. I think they're saying looking beyond Trump, more so the risk that governments regulate cryptocurrency.
I mean, Bitcoin would be very hard to regulate because it's not, they can't control it, right? It's controlled by a network of computers around the globe. And I would argue that the SEC prior to the Trump administration had a chokehold on it. I mean, in some cases, it's almost surprising that it survived through the Gary Gensler SEC administration. I mean, you had a lot of obviously bad actors in the space. There were obviously well-noted media events that took place, and it continued to thrive, exist, and now I would argue almost on the verge of flourishing. So because it's not controlled by a central bank, it'll continue to exist. And I would argue that, the SEC was very, very anti-crypto in general prior to the current administration.
Let's stay on government. I have a follow-up kind of question on what's happening with governments and in terms of them holding crypto, storing crypto, building reserves with cryptocurrency. Any update there?
Yeah, for sure. The first main piece of legislation that was passed was called the Genius Act. That passed 6 or 7 weeks ago, and that applied directly to stablecoins, which we don't need to go into today, but it brought a framework and regulatory aspect to how they operate. And that was really supported by an IPO called Circle, which is the second largest stablecoin issuer, went public 6 or 7 weeks ago and is up 4 or 5x from the initial price. Second is the Clarity Act, which basically is halfway home. It actually passed through the House and now sits in the Senate. But like the Genius Act, the Senate was very, very bipartisan. I want to say that the Genius Act through the Senate passed 68 to 32, I believe. So we're anticipating it'll pass. And that brings a regulatory framework to crypto overall. And more importantly, who is going to regulate it? Prior to this, the SEC would give you one answer, the CFTC would give you another answer. There was no real structure as to who the governing body will be. The Clarity Act actually changes that and brings it hard and fast. What was the second part of your question?
Just our government's building crypto reserves. I mean, I think you hear about certain countries utilizing it, Venezuela, for example, more than others. What's the U.S. stance? I heard that the U.S. has been building crypto reserves. I mean, are they buying it or are they just keeping what they take from criminal activities? What's the thought there? And then maybe even pivot that into corporations, because I know some major industry leaders in various different industries, the Jamie Dimons of the world, have actually changed their tune on being anti-Bitcoin, and now they're kind of pro-thesis for Bitcoin as a part of the portfolio.
Yeah, all good questions. So the U.S. has attempted to establish a strategic Bitcoin reserve. The details to this point are a little bit fuzzy, but you referenced it earlier. They hold currently about 200,000 Bitcoin. Under the prior administration, that was going to be sold blindly into the market. That stance was reversed. We currently hold 200,000, and the details as to will we accumulate that and in what framework still needs to evolve. What is clear is you can actually increase the budget surplus and you can't actually make it a burden on taxpayers, right? You can't do that. So how do you accumulate it? When I heard Hester Pierce speak from the SEC, one of the ways they're looking at it is the U.S. has several different reserve assets. Gold is obvious. Oil is another one. I was not aware of this when I heard the talk, but we actually have a cheese reserve. You could actually move buckets. You could say, wow, instead of holding all gold, we move it to Bitcoin. Instead of maybe sell some of our oil reserve, maybe sell some of our cheese reserve. So the details are still there, are yet to be worked out. But I think that will happen over time. Brazil and Japan have actually followed suit. They're starting to do the same thing. 22 states currently have legislation to do so. Arizona and New Hampshire are already doing it. Bitcoin might become more attractive because you might be able to get a better return. You're not going to put all of your cash reserves in Bitcoin, but companies like Microsoft and Meta that have huge balance sheets are starting to put that as an agenda item on their shareholder meetings. It doesn't mean it'll happen. But if a company like Meta put 50 basis points of their cash reserves in Bitcoin, that would be a fairly substantial number.